Hello and welcome. My name is Shannon Kemp and I'm the Chief Digital Manager for Dataversity. We'd like to thank you for joining today's Dataversity webinar, Business Value Through Reference and Master Data Strategies. It is the latest installment in a monthly series called Data Ed Online with Dr. Peter Aiken. Just a couple of points to get us started. Due to the large number of people that attend these sessions, you will be muted during the webinar. For questions, we will be collecting them via the Q&A or if you like to tweet, we encourage you to share highlights or questions via Twitter using hashtag DataEd. And if you'd like to chat with us or with each other, we certainly encourage you to do so. Just click the chat icon. And you can find the Q&A panel or the chat panel. The icons are in the bottom middle of your screen there for those features. And to answer the most commonly asked questions, as always, we will send a follow-up email to all registrants within 2 business days containing links to the slides. And yes, we are recording and we'll likewise send a link to the recording of this session as well as any additional information requested throughout the webinar. Now let me introduce to you our speaker for today, Dr. Peter Aiken. Peter is an internationally recognized data management thought leader. Many of you already know him or have seen him at conferences worldwide. He has more than 30 years of experience and has received many awards for his outstanding contributions to the profession. He has written dozens of articles and 11 books. The most recent is Your Data Strategy. Peter is experienced with more than 500 data management practices in 20 countries and constantly named as a top data management expert. Some of the most important and largest organizations in the world have sought out his expertise. Peter has spent multi-year immersions with groups as diverse as the U.S. Department of Defense, Deutsche Bank, Nokia, Wells Fargo, the Commonwealth of Virginia, and Walmart. And with that, let me turn everything over to Peter to get today's webinar started. Hello and welcome.
Thank you so much, Shannon. It's such a pleasure to be here with everybody today. Thank you for joining us, taking time out of your busy day to learn a little bit more about data. And as you guys know, you can wind me up and I'll talk about data to anybody for any reason at all. So let's jump in. Today's topic obviously is reference and master data. And we're going to talk about it from a strategic perspective. Very important to keep that in mind because reference and master data are strategies. They are not tools. They are not projects. And those are the 2 biggest mistakes people make when they're approaching this right from the start. Let's just dive in. What I'm going to talk about today overall is an intro to data management in particular, because you have to understand reference and master data is oftentimes people's first exposure to the broader subject of data management in general. And within that context, what is reference and master data management? You'll almost always hear it talked about as master data management, but we like to say reference and master, and I'll show you why. Why are they important? Will be our next topic, and then we'll look at some very specific building blocks in there. We'll close down the content portion of the program with a series of guiding principles and best practices around the topic. And then we'll finish up with a couple of quick takeaways while we get ready for your questions and answers at the top of the next hour. So most, unfortunately, businesses still, even in 2021, think of data as this sort of bat sign that shows up somewhere between IT and the business. And by the time they finished studying this, they realized that data is much bigger than they originally thought. And it actually does bind together IT and the business. But the reality of the situation, if you work in here with the rest of us, is that data is something we're all swimming in. And we're simply nowhere close to approaching real understanding of it at a value added level. We spend lots of money on it, but the question of the value that we get out of it is really the issue. So let's jump in here with a bit on Maslow. Maslow, you may remember from high school, is the one who said that there are a necessary but insufficient set of conditions that lead to a condition that we all want to achieve as human beings. But if we have food and shelter needs unmet, physiological needs unmet, then we can never be safe. If we are never safe, then we can never be part of something that is bigger than us. And if we're never part of something that is bigger than us, then we really don't have a very good understanding of our own individual capabilities. And all of these, of course, as I said, are a prerequisite to what everybody wants to do, which is self-actualize. Now, if you look at the TED literature around there, the self-actualization term is called flow, but it's the same concept in general. You're working at your highest potential as a contributing member of society. Now, the reason I show this is because data is an awful lot like that. We have a lot of things here at the top of this golden pyramid. Notice that master data management is #1 on my particular list. But we have other things, big data, analytics. If I was going to update the chart, I would add Bitcoin and blockchain and all the rest of the things there. These things are fine, but they are literally the self-actualization. And unfortunately, if you do not first provide a good set of foundational data management practices, everything that is up in that top area is much more difficult, because the things in the top area are technology focused, and the things in the bottom of this chart are capability focused. So most organizations try to start with the technologies, and that's because the vendors who sell those technologies are good and they provide valuable stuff. But there's a big disconnect between our technical capabilities with these tools and our organizational maturity. So that if we try to go in, and people will say this to me all the time, Peter, I hear you. You got to do this foundational stuff before you do the fun stuff and all that sort of stuff, and provide a good foundation. Can you do it faster? Is the question that they ask me, and the answer to that is absolutely. We can go faster, but if I go faster, it will take longer. If I go faster, it will cost you more. If I go faster, we will deliver less, and if I go faster, it will present you with a greater organizational risk, because not having these foundational practices in place is problematic in another way. I'm going to show that here. And again, contextually, another view of data management. This is the CMMI Institute's perspective on it. They look at it as 5 practice areas that if you don't have the ability to manage data coherently as an organization, that's going to be a problem. And if you cannot access a professional class of data governance professionals in this day and age, that is going to present you with a problem. If you don't understand the lifecycle management implications, if you don't understand that quality is a relative term on this, and that you have the right platform and architecture in place, it will be difficult to do data correctly. Now, I say that because these 5 areas need to work in concert, but more importantly, they as a construct can only be as strong as the weakest link. So I'm going to give you a quick example here now. The scale is that you get 1 point for having a pulse, 2 points if you have management of your existing practices, 3 points if there's documentation supporting those management practices. If you take measurements of the things that you have defined, then you get 4 points, and you get a 5-point scale if you use the data that you obtain from your measurements to optimize the process. Long story short, let me just give you an example on this, where this particular organization, hypothetically speaking, is a 3. They have documentation on the operations platform architecture, on the governance management strategy and data quality. They do not have good documentation on these bottom 2 that are 1s. And those bottom 2 are the weak link in the chain, because the entire stack is only that strong. Add to that the challenge that everybody encounters data in a haphazard and random fashion in different ways. And so just as the blind people meeting the elephant, they will see different aspects of data and think that is, 1, all there is to it, and 2, that their part is more important than everybody else's. We'll shrink that little elephant down there and look at it. And it's part of this is our fault. We've been defining data management as everything that occurs between when data is obtained and when data is used, but that's kind of squishy and doesn't really give us a good definition here. So we also, in that context, forget about the fact that we need to reuse. That is our goal, not just to use data, but to reuse data. That's where we really obtain leverage around that. And so a better definition of data management, it's not quite as pithy as all that, says that data is divided up into obtaining and engineering and arrangement types of activities. And don't worry, we're not going to go through each of these, and some sort of exploitation capabilities on the other side where we're trying to use it. And then within that context, we can look and say, well, that makes sense, but we still need to add in the part that most people aren't very good at. How do we reuse all of this? And all of this is to say that master data management is part of the preparation aspects and part of the delivery aspects in here. So we're looking at a small subsection of data management, but a very, very important one. So that's our contextual perspective on this. Let's dive in and look specifically at MDM in this case. Now, we put this together. If this is the first time that you're seeing this, shame on us. This is from DAMA International's DIMBOK. And the idea here is that you could see within the subject area of data, we've divided it up into 11 pi wedges plus a circle, sorry, 10 pi wedges plus one circle, 11 chunks here, and reference and master data is one of the main chunks. But again, you can see there's lots of other components here as well. That's really the subject of these data ed processes as we're going around the wheel and talking about different aspects of all of these here. Well, the definition here, here's a good one from a TDWI publication: planning, implementation, and control activities to ensure consistency with the golden version of contextual values. Good definition, ouch though. Try to explain that. And by the way, if you're introducing this topic to people who are non-data people, they are more likely to understand MDM as mobile data management instead of master data management. That's a completely different topic, but it is nevertheless challenging. When we talk about a gold version, we're talking about the old age of pressing analog records, and we would make the master record and then press all the copies of the 45 EPs or LPs, what was the small one's called? Anyway, off of that golden master. And the same thing is true when you look at this, but it's not, again, a technology. It's a discipline. It's a strategy. It's an approach. And it says, we're going to try to make sure that we can put together and agree on some subsection of all of the data that we have. And the ones that we're going to concentrate on are items that would be considered master or reference data. Now, as I said, it's sold as a technology solution, but what we're really talking about is the parties, the places, and the things that we have in our organizations around this. Those, if we get to a definition of reference data, just for starters, is control over the domain values, also known as the vocabularies. So this is control over the things that are used as keys, as codes, as definitions, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a really good time to introduce the concept of taxonomy to others that are not doing this. So, for example, I know I worked with a number of automobile companies over the years, and they had real trouble at the dealer level defining the concept of customer. There was a current customer and there was a potential customer. One of the lessons that they all seem to have to learn individually was you probably don't want to sell, you probably don't want to send commercials to people that just bought your car. I actually was a recipient of when I bought a car. The next month, the same car dealer sent me the notice that the car had been marked down $250. It's just not a great message. So we want to treat those as separate classes, subgroups of customers in there. And then the question, of course, management looks at the first piece of this and says, well, that's kind of easy. We can take care of that. Then you say, well, where does the concept of an X customer fit in? Is it a potential customer or a current customer? And under our current customers, do we want to differentiate between residential and commercial customers to take a look at this? All this to be said, these reference data items are very critical. And of course, when somebody wants to come back and add a new concept like a VIP customer, we may have even more challenges around all of that. Continuing with the reference data, this is, again, the idea that we're going to keep track of certain things. And one of the more popular examples of this, if you look in your own data sets, you're likely to see the same thing, is that people, when they are coding for various reference data sets, they will code US as US and they will code UK as UK. But of course, the proper identifier, the one for the standard, is GB, Great Britain. And consequently, if we ask the question, how many customers do we have in the United Kingdom, we may not get the correct answer if everybody hasn't been following or using the common reference data within there. Now, moving on to master data, we flip it around the other side here. Master data is the same thing, but now instead of predefined values, we're now going to allow allowable values. So they dictate format and allowable ranges. Again, our three concepts here: parties, locations, entities around this. They provide the context for the transactions here. And I'm going to give you an example from an old way of processing, which is where the name for this actually came from. It's the term master file. Now let me show you what a master file was. In the old days, we would take an old master file if we were a banking application, and it might say that Peter's balance as of the start of today is $100, and that Peter then goes out and buys a sandwich for $5. And at night, sometime later on, the transaction would be applied to the master file balance, and that would result in a new balance of $95 on this. And if there were error messages, we would include them for just general good coding practices. You'll notice that the master data consisted in this instance of the balance of my account with this particular organization, assuming it's a bank or something like that. Another example here, just to show a contrast between reference and master data. Again, reference data is that we are providing the specific terms that we have on here. In this case, it's a slide that I've used in a number of different contexts that showed in 1 year that the FBI and the Canadian Social Security system used the same 9 gender codes. So there were 9 possibilities. This is reference data. If we wanted to add a different code and the system wouldn't allow it, that might be a problem. You can see also it has beyond the just 1 and 2 in terms of the various values. There's a whole series of stories around that slide. We're not going to get into them as well. But the fact that we maintain these 9 specific gender codes at that point in time, the FBI and the Canadian Social Security system matched up for various reasons. The master data then would be the fact that the customer, Pat, would have a specific gender. Again, could be number 6, doesn't tell. Okay, those are valid. Notice both of these provide context for the transaction data. Now that should tell you that as you look around here, you'll now start to say, okay, we're focusing on a subset of data. Why are these 2 subsets so important? And that's because it turns out there are really only 3 types of data. I always like to acknowledge this one example comes from my colleague Chris Bradley on this reference data, which controls the accessible values. For example, it might be a list of countries where we do business. If the countries where we do business are not on the list of countries we do business with, then we can't do business with that country. Right? Types of accounts, controlled vocabulary items, et cetera, et cetera. And this provides us with a great deal of leverage over, in this case, master data, which this really is a way of thinking of controlling access to systems capabilities. Are you a member of our premium club? Are you authorized to do this? And most importantly, at the master data level, it establishes common data structures that are then propagated throughout the rest of the organization. And this everything else data now becomes instances of values governed by the master data, which is in turn partly governed by the reference data. So I hope you see now the leverage potential here. If we're going to start doing our data better, this oftentimes is a very good way of starting. Now let's specifically look at what is a strategy around this, because I've said this is a strategy, and strategy has been, I believe, misused starting in about the 1950s when the business community got a hold of the word strategy and overcomplicated it. Master plans, blah, blah, blah. The version of strategy that I like to use is derived from the US military, which says it's a pattern in a stream of decisions. And it's much less of a thing and much more of a series of outcomes around this. But we're trying to drive outcomes. Now, if we think of this as a strategy, then what that says is things that we do over time that are strategic should support the ability of the organization to better organize data that has a lot of leverage, the master and reference data for our particular organization. Unfortunately, the way these things mainly turn out, and I say mainly, yes, more fail than succeed. It's not as bad as data lakes, which have an 85% failure rate, but the failure rate around these is about very typical with IT projects. 1 in 3 succeeds with full functionality, with the budget within the budget that was specified, and of course in the schedule that was specified as well. In fact, it looks more like this here at the end of year 1, which was a total technology play in this particular organization. They spent, I swear to you, I was there, they spent $60 million on their master data management. There were literally plane loads of consultants that came in every week to help install the system, and by golly, they installed it really well. But 1 year after it was installed, the business didn't know how to use the MDM. I would walk around the halls and I would hear people say things like, well, I couldn't figure out where to put the data, so I stuck it in the MDM. Well, right away, you know, you've made a massive error in that case. And my stool doesn't stand up very well. So there was general agreement that they needed to restart the effort. They did a root cause analysis and consensus on the idea that it was poor quality data that they had and inadequate training in there. Management again oversimplified the response, however, and said, oh, there was some data quality problems, so you all better get data quality-ing. I know that's a not very good use of English. Again, they were immature. It was a pure technology focus. And if there's one thing I've learned over the years, it is that bad data plus anything awesome at all is still going to be bad data. Well, if we look at approaching our data better, most consultants will come in here and say, hey, this is our methodology, right? Well, I like to say it's a realistic way to begin practicing MDM. And the idea is three-legged stool does make a lot of sense. Select 3 most relevant data practice areas. In this case, we're going to be talking about obviously reference and master data management, but we'll add in on this little vignette here, data quality perhaps, and governance in order to do this. Because the problem with all of these is that they are interdependent. So if we look at data governance, it makes the case it is responsible for data quality, which is a necessary but insufficient prerequisite for the success of master data, which again, these master data management capabilities constrain governance effectiveness and can support it as well in that sense. So this interdependency is very, very clear. You'll see a couple of the other examples on this as we go further into the presentation here. So the first approach, the first, let's just say 90 days, right? Not a bad way to start, is maybe focusing in on implementing a combination, hopefully a well-orchestrated combination of improving the data in the reference and master data management. By the way, the reason you would want to improve the data is because if the data in the reference and master data management technology is of less quality than it is on the outside, you've got a big problem because you've already seen the leverage issue on this. And how are you going to ensure that? Well, you need to filter it on the way in. So there's a quality component. And governance is the piece that makes sure that quality takes place. Notice also everybody kind of gets credit for one unit, if you will, of what they've done in this. We've practiced data governance once, we've practiced data quality on a process, we've practiced reference and master data. We now get to iteration number 2 in this case. We're still working on solving a MDM type problem, but now we're going to put in place a bit of metadata management. And we're still doing governance. And by the way, the reason we switched from quality to metadata was because we learned more about the problem. We solved the problems that we could with data quality. Now we've moved over to master data. And yes, we're still talking about reference and master data management in here. Notice everybody gets 2 pluses on this, although it's the first 1 unit of work on the metadata. Third one, just real quickly again, reference and master data, but maybe by this point we figured out we need to re-architect some things. Architecture is going to be important because another very important component for reference and master data management to interact with is process architecture. We'll get to that in just a quick second. Keep that in mind, though. That's one way of approaching the bit. Another component for this master data is to talk about a controlled vocabulary here. And if we precisely specify these terms, we will do much better. For example, this was an organization that was trying to do master data management in here, but actually what their problem was that they had an accounting system that didn't well distinguish the different types of tanks that they used as a business. And so while it understood these types of tanks, it didn't understand these other types of tanks that were also part of the business. And the company decided to solve their problem by simply using a controlled vocabulary. Nobody in the company is allowed to use the word tank. They must qualify the tank in this case, actually in all cases, in order to use this. And this avoided, in this case, spending lots of money on a technology solution. Of course, then there's another type of tank we need to make sure we don't get mixed up with the process here as well. Fun humor there, but does work out here. Again, there are many, many places reference and master data will pull up in your organization where you'll have master data around the payroll data and around the finance and other sorts of things. But of course, the real problem is when you start to do exchanging this data back and forth, it becomes very problematic from a number of different perspectives, as in which one is the best one to use. A true story: at my university, Virginia Commonwealth University, about, I believe, 15 years ago, if a student needed to make a change of address, we would hand them a piece of paper that had contact information for the 6 different places around the university that students were sent to make sure that their address was updated in all 6 relevant places. Of course, there's better ways of serving the customers at this point, and that is by itself perhaps a good argument for implementing master data management in your organizations. The general pattern of how these are implemented, how we clean up the mess that I was showing, is that we have a useful term now, a data steward. A data steward is somebody who has a fiduciary relationship with the data on behalf of the organization, and that they are managing the codes. It could be done out of a spreadsheet, no problem at all. In fact, one of the things that we always advise organizations is not to jump in right away and buy the tool, but to build your own lightweight version of a reference and master data management system yourself to learn more about it at a much lower cost of entry to that process. But anyway, there's some sort of a code management system. And again, like I said, most people want to go spend a lot of money on it, but you can do it with a spreadsheet in there. And that this then gives you a controlled update of the databases of record, so that when we release a new version of the table that has the gender codes in it, we've gone from the 9 from the FBI to the 63 that Facebook keeps track of. It's done in a controlled release in order to do that. This directs other types of output to the other transactional systems that are there that give you the various bits and pieces, so that when it gets into all of the various places that you need to get it to, it propagates through the system, and we know how long it's going to take and how much effort it's going to take in order to do that. We may also subscribe in some cases to external data and get data in via subscriptions on there. Just a basic process on this, but the problem is your organization likely isn't set up to do just reference in this case, and that the master version of it looks somewhat similar. Notice what we don't have is that system for managing codes, because of course there is no system of managing unique identifiers for individuals, a lot of people's names and things like that. So there's more likely to be sort of a combined architecture when you buy these things in the first place. As I said before, it's very easy, however, to develop your own, and perhaps we can cover that during some of the Q&A portion we get on this. I mentioned that the architecture was important, and you'll recall the 3rd iteration of that little implementation piece there. Talked about the data architecture on this. We also need, as a critical success factor for our master data management processing, to be able to complement our existing organizational business process architecture. This means that we come back in and take a look at some things that are going on in our organization, particularly in the areas that we're going to change. Again, just imagine we're going to change the technology. Yes, we should examine the business practices for potential impact. If we're going to change the business practices, we should also examine the technology to make sure that there's a potential impact there as well. If we don't look actively for these things, we won't be able to find them as we go through it. So the task orientation was just that we had, think of people putting things on assembly lines in this case. The process orientation might be a little bit different in that we might be switching to components, larger size components, integrated components, et cetera, around there to take a look at it, and reunifying these tasks because of the availability of read once and write anywhere type of technology from a data processing perspective. In addition to this, however, we also need to look at the various rules and things that are there. Most organizations go, wait a minute, why are we talking about process architecture? Well, first of all, it's not that we have to go back and derive it in general, but for the pieces where the the technology is going to interact, it is crucial to understand them. And there's a wonderful piece, QPR colleagues in the European environment have created a software as a service piece where you can feed in a log file into this, and it will actually help you to not give you a perfect process map when you bring it back out, but it will give you information that is useful that you need to have in there, and a notion of a process map with even some percentages and things that can be inferred depending on how your log files are actually keeping track of these things. And this can give you important information because, as I said, the process integration is critical. And I'm going to use as an example here a massive failure on the part of industrial engineers in the automobile industry for much of the 21st century. We've been dealing with internal combustion engines, and people sort of think of them as this is the model that we need to do. And what they tried to do was replace this. If we want to go green, we will replace the traditional engine. And everybody got it wrong until Toyota came along and discovered that it wasn't the replacement of the existing engine that you should be trying for, but in this case, the complementing of the existing engine's capabilities. Now, I've been driving a Prius since 2005. That makes me one of those obnoxious Prius drivers, but I'm going to spend a minute here and show you that in the Prius architecture, there is a traditional engine, but there is also an electric engine that can power the car. And of course, all this is highly dependent on a large integrated battery system. And if you watch the video on this here, what you're seeing here is that the engine is in use sometimes as you're accelerating. If you put your foot off the gas, it brings engine energy back into the system through the braking process on this. And that sometimes that you can, what I'm telling you here is that instead of replacing the engine, we're now switching back and forth with the engine and the electric motor on a somewhat constant basis, back and forth, complementing each other. All this insight, of course, was critical to making this happen. And as you've seen, many other companies are now following the hybrid route. Of course, this all is dependent on battery technologies, and Mr. Musk will eventually get the Tesla that down to the price everybody wants it at. Again, different topic entirely. Here's another business process overview, and we're not going to walk through this one, but sometimes it is critically important that you have even this much information about your existing business processes. So a critical factor in this is to make sure that you understand how the proposed technical solution, when you get to the point of buying one, will actually complement your existing architecture, because the mismatch between there is as fatal as the idea of replacing the gas engine was in 2003 when they invented the Prius. All right, next section here. Let's talk about some very specific building blocks. And the idea in general around here are to understand the goals and principles. And the goals and principles of the master data management initiatives are to provide authoritative sources of high quality master and reference data. That there is one place that you know to get the people, places, and things information about the organization. Everybody knows that's where it's updated. Again, if we don't know, it's happening multiple times. So this is much less about technology and much more about creating order out of chaos in this case. That another goal and principle is that whatever that organization I was describing to you all earlier that spent 60 million on the reference and master data system and then trashed it within a year and had to completely rebuild it. Yes, that's clearly not exhibiting a lower cost and lower complexity in that case. That organization failed at the process of doing this. But of course, our goals are tangible, which means we have to have initial measurements and we have to understand what kind of reuse measures we can put in place. And our third goal, equally as important, all three, is to provide really detailed support for any types of analytical efforts that go on beyond this, any type of data exploitation activities, because we are providing standard data structures and a standard way of accessing them. This makes it easier for all parties to understand their activities going through the process. There are a whole series of activities that we can talk about here in order to understand these. And then the first one is, where is the organization using these common data? Again, you can see these are the same questions you'd ask even if we didn't have something called master data management, but we're doing it in a narrowly defined context. And that narrowly defined context gives us enough business focus and makes the dollar cost of this very much easier to concentrate in a few simple equations that we can then look at an ROI in order to do this. We also need to understand the inputs and outputs to the master data management systems, the sources, the contributors to it, and how this master data management component fits into our larger data architecture in this. We need to be able to implement the technologies here when it's appropriate. Again, guidance to you all is if you're thinking about buying it and their price is 7 figures or greater, I would say it's much more worthwhile to spend 3 years building your own solutions, real solutions, folks, and then look at the ability to implement something much larger in all of these. The idea of defining and maintaining match rules, how we're going to identify what is it we're going to use to identify things, figure out where things are. How do we establish from a process perspective the golden records, and where do they go technically so that everybody can gain access to them at the appropriate time with the appropriate refresh type capabilities. That these hierarchies, back to the ontology of the customer that I was talking about and how those are related to other components, are important in there. That you could look at and plan and pre-integrate, if you will, new data sources that you're thinking of complementing your existing data assets with, that you could replicate and distribute these reference and master data management solutions to different parts of the organization or to different technologies. Okay, it's working great on our 3270 terminals. If you don't know what that is, great question at the end here. But how do I push it to my BlackBerry? And maintain changes, of course, because we need to update the reference and master data. Again, activities that are going to be in there, but they're going to be prioritized because remember, this is a strategy. So these are things that happen as a result of the implementation of the strategy. We can look at specific investigations around this, saying who needs what information, what business problems are we solving, what data is available from the different sources, how does the data from the different sources differ, and how can we resolve the inconsistencies so that we can get people to reconcile the values. Now, a very important governance component here for everybody to understand. Notice we're having to make selections. Oh my goodness, there are 3 sources of data that we have. Which one is correct? Well, immediately the term my data comes up. And if your organization has any guts at all, it will prohibit the owning of data by anybody other than the organization itself, because these are people issues that we're talking about in the last 2 in terms of the reconciliation and the valid values being shared and things like that. If people say use my data versus just make it a rule, nobody, this is a governance issue, nobody can own any data in the organization. And reference and master data management makes this case very clearly, because if we own those bits on the smaller pieces that are leveraging the big yellow dot that I was showing on that previous slide, there's absolutely no way that anybody can have an effect on it if you'll spend all your time trying to carve up the ownership pieces of it. The primary deliverables from a master data and reference data activities are some sense of cleansing, so that when things are brought into the master data reference environment, it is also of known data quality. Notice I didn't say it's of perfect data quality. Known is usually good enough for most organizations. In fact, too many organizations can make the following statement: all of our data is of unknown quality. Don't put that on your K1 form, folks. That's not a recipe for success there. What are the requirements for reference and master data as you're working in this environment and as you're understanding the organization's evolution? What data models and documentation are we going to need? Because again, reusable data structures are only reusable if everybody understands them. They must be documented at the level they are at least a level 3 from our CMMI scale that we talked about before. Reliable reference and master data is a deliverable. If we have everything else, but we're not actually delivering the data, nobody cares. Again, where does the provenance, the lineage of the golden record come from? Where did that data come from is a question people ask. Well, again, if it's in our reference and master data management environment, it should be easy to determine that based on the existing information that we've added in there. And finally, the data quality measures that are in there. We're going to take a look at what's going on. How are we doing this? And how is our system being used? Because that will take us from a level 3 to a level 4 if we start collecting those measures and reporting on them. And then as people understand more about the system and its functionality within our larger IT infrastructure, we will then be able to improve the functionality of the reference and master data management system in there based on this self-reporting that goes on. Could take a quick breath, right? Okay, so there are several roles and responsibilities that we need to pay attention to here as well. There are committees, again, from the governance angle that keeps track of this. There'll be inputs in that. There'll be consumers that will be looking at these as well. And again, different ideas. We can formally describe their requirements in here in a way that actually provides good metadata for the rest of the organization going forward. And of course, there's a whole different set of participants that we bring to the process. Again, the Data Governance Council may describe this as one of their primary efforts or their initial efforts, or it may be one of 10 things the Data Governance Council is doing. Not at all a problem, although there is the risk of taking on too many projects as organizations do this. Let's talk a little bit more about the build your own, and I'll do that in the context of the tools here. Now, first of all, if you're not familiar with the term ETL, I should have spelled that out. I apologize. It's extract, transform, and load. And those technologies are ideally suited for loading data warehouses as well as reference and master data management solutions. And in fact, they can also propagate the data from your reference and master data management solutions. So ETL is likely to be a very good source of metadata, particularly if you have an existing environment. The metadata that's in your ETL field is actually quite valuable, and be able to use it to exploit some other aspects of your different applications. As I mentioned before, there are lots of these applications, but you don't really need one. You can take your own organization and stand up a SQL Server or other type of similar database piece and manage just one piece of master data out of it, literally one attribute, and get practice at doing that. And then you can expand that one attribute to a data structure of some sort. I've got one hospital client right now that's just keeping track of the doctors that they have, and understanding the dimensions of keeping track of the doctors affiliated with a large hospital system is a non-trivial operation. We can then look at also various data modeling tools if we need to describe how this is done from both a reverse and a forward engineering. Some process modeling tools, a little bit of metadata repository that put into the process. These are all various technologies, but you do not need to go out and spend 7 figures on any of these to get them started. I guarantee you, you have somebody in your organization who is perfectly capable of building your own version of a master data management solution internally for you to try out and learn and solve problems with. Another component that fewer organizations are familiar with are a set of data profiling tools. These are tools we talk about in more detail in the data quality webinar around this, but they are things that can help understand data sets and become more familiar with them. I call it the introduction to the data set toolkit. These simultaneously can also be cleansing tools, or there's another set of cleansing tools, integration tools, business process rule engines, change management tools, lots of things you can do. The question here is, can you figure out the appropriate subset of tools to build your own in order to do that very first one so that you can start to learn about the process? Because the real problem with tools is that a fool with a tool is still a fool. And I can, as I said, describe many, many instances where organizations have spent 7, 8 figures on master data management solutions and thrown their money absolutely down the drain. Let's look at why this is such a hard problem. Here's an example from a bank that I worked with where they had a series of systems of record. This is their version of the master data management, but they had multiple ones for multiple types. And their question was, they wanted to get to know their customers better. So rather than directly link their systems of record up with this, they created an extract indication service that put a small repository out such that when a customer interacted through one of many channels that they had, instead of having to go back and hit the system of record, they could hit this repository and just say, are they somebody we've talked to recently or somebody we'd like to talk to? And create a list of customer contact goals that can then be used to update, get to know the customer better in this case, and then be added on for when we bring in additional processing capabilities. You can see these things are quite complex. Here's another organization where their master data catalog here at the very center in the tiniest of writing that I've put here is highly integrated with their data quality engineering and knowledge management practice efforts, as well as their organizational data. You can see here, if the organizational process architecture is not supportive or supported by the master data management solution, the opportunity for chaos here is astounding. One final example here, again, looking at different monitoring process on the top here with different practices in the bottom. It's just a very complex environment. I won't have time to describe each and every one of those components as we go through there, but there are some very good examples of all this. Now, I've already describe to you the aspects here that are really most problematic, and that is that people go through reference and master data management. They get recommended as a good place to start. It is a good place to start, but buying that large complex package is probably not the best investment for organizations. So we're going to talk a little bit about these. Fred Cohen's made a joke here and said they have 180% failure rate. Well, it's not exactly correct, but there are lots and lots of challenges around this. 99% were less than fully satisfied with their data programs, and 70% even less than just satisfied. So there's a lot of room for improvement in data in general. When we look at organizations, many cannot track and don't have governance around their market data spends in this. 25% of the clients in the reference systems are often duplicated data. Now, I have a statistic that I propagate a lot, and that is that 80% of organizational data is redundant, obsolete, or trivial. In this case, this is backing it up. It's not quite as high as that in here. And one of the reasons you do it is to reduce the data that is redundant, obsolete, or trivial in your organizations. 64% are planning to re-architect their reference data because they didn't do as good a job as they should have in the original installation, because they didn't understand, in all likelihood, their existing process architectures and the interactions that they needed to have between the two of those. So again, I keep harping on that point. I know it's not a whole lot of fun to listen to it, but it is critically important to understand this. And organizations are spending millions of dollars a year on these activities. And again, there's a series of goals that we can go through here. 30% come out as outright failures. Complex environments require even more. Let's change that. The more, excuse me. Try that a second time here. The more complex your environment, the more you will benefit from your master data management technologies and the strategy that goes along with them. The root cause of failures are that they have ineffective leadership. I've been on organizations, as I said before, where I've observed large investments in them, but they are not sustained when they sort of say, okay, project's done, we can now, no, you're just starting at that point. Don't ever think this. In fact, get it in everybody in your organization's head that you will not need your master data management solution when the organization also no longer needs its HR solution. After all, nobody says, I think everybody's going to behave themselves from this point going forward, or we don't need any lawyers. I think we've got it all taken care of, and we'll just let anybody go back to whatever hiring practices that they want to have. No, HR has been recognized and understood here as the better way of dealing with these types of issues. This is our version of HR for data, is a good way to think of it. But it's not a project. And if it's implemented as one, it's very unlikely to succeed. Many people think that their ERPs, their enterprise resource planning, their Oracle, their PeopleSoft, their SAP systems are their MDM solutions. All of them have modules for master data management, but it, as the ERP, is not one by itself. Neither is a data warehouse. And this as clearly is not an IT effort. IT needs to be involved and will be helpful in standing up the software, but we cannot run this as an IT project and expect it to succeed. It is separate from data governance and separate from data quality activities, but I've shown you in the example that I've used, and it's a popular example, so by all means take a gander at it and see if it works for you. But it's definitely distinct from each of those, and they're implemented with the wrong types of technologies. Again, by the wrong type, it usually is that the vendor has a product that works very, very well, but is very difficult to use. And I don't mean it's hard to use, it's complex, and it needs somebody who really understands it. And just handing that to IT and saying, hey, manage this thing, is not the way to get it to work. Again, we have internal politics and silo mentalities that translate all around these types of activities here. Let's look instead at some success factors that are more useful. As users and prospects understand the strengths and limitations of the MDM solution, they will start to appreciate what it does and say, I have some data, can I bring that to the MDM solution? That's when you know you succeeded there, when they understand that. But again, people barely understand data, so understanding the master data management is very good to have examples that you can show them in your environment and say, this is what we're trying to do. By taking very small steps, and this entire space is going to evolve rapidly. 20 years ago, people would have just said, you mean the master files? Because that's all we did in those days, were the master files. Obviously, the world is more complex than when I started out on this. It's critical to assure, to set expectations correctly. It's absolutely critical to make sure this effort becomes part of, and it retains part of, the overall information architecture and the overall integrated organizational architecture. That this has a governance frameworks such that individuals do this type of process for appropriate activities. Again, I mentioned the example of my colleagues that are working in the hospital environment, just trying to list the doctors. Another expansion of that might be, okay, we've got a good picture on how complex it is to manage the doctors. We've designed processes, and now we can go out and look for a technology to implement that. While we're doing that, we could also then expand the scope of our master data management to include the nurses. Hey, very similar type of expansion, but not something that will go along that. Again, focusing in this case so that they can look at reasonable expansions in this. Looking at aligning with the organization's business vision, using the framework to go through and understand as a strategy how these capabilities can help the organization better manage its only non-depleting, non-degrading, durable strategic asset. Making sure that somebody understands that for every dollar they are investing in your MDM program, that somebody is getting clearly more than a dollar's worth out of it on the other side. And that's on an annualized basis. This means you're going to have an MDM strategy and a vision, that you'll have measures that you're using as your program gets more mature, and that you'll create business cases and maintain the business cases. And let different parts of the business look at their own critical practice indicators as you go through the process of articulating the success in here, and they can then better manage their business. So it's sort of a substructure of the organizational KPIs in that you measure before and after, so that you can gain credit for the change, that you can translate the change into financial results. We're really good at saying data things happen, but we're not quite as good when we go a little further and say data things happened, and therefore these organizational things happened in this. And again, lastly, that the business and IT understands that the way to manage first steps at approaching a largely data debt laden organization is through a master data management single view initiative around the process. This next little bit here, as we get to the top of the hour, is sort of 10 practices, and we could go through these as well, but they're not significantly different. Here's a guiding principles that I do like, though. Shared data belongs to the organization. I've already said, don't let anybody own anything, that it's an ongoing process that can't be achieved by one goal. And the stewards are really key in order to do this, that these golden values, these branded data sets, become the best sources and are understood as the only ones that it should be used in this, and that you replicate these things only from those sources, that this process requires a formal change management system in order to get it right. So there's a couple of them in between. I skipped over the one that was 10, but look at them and then get the idea. I think you're getting the sense here from this. Let me give you what I consider the best explanation by any organization under the sun to date for explaining what master and reference data management is going to do to the organization. This example is from British Telecom, and I say thanks to Dave Evans every time I give it out. It's a little bit cute here. It's about a minute, and it cost them £500. That's not quite a lot of money to create a little animation showing what was going to happen. Here we go. Effective ways of describing what an organizational master data management program is going to do. Previously, information was stored in hundreds of databases across BT. Processes were duplicated. It was a bit messy. Now we're storing all of our data in a series of 7 master files. That's the scope of their project. They called it the 7 Sisters, a very catchy name describing the overall process around it. Again, good job, BT, on doing this. And lots of people say, hey, can I get access to that? Well, you can have access to the recording here, so you can certainly screen clip out the little bit. If you want a more direct copy, let me know, and I'll be glad to get you a copy of that. So where are we in our program? Again, we've looked at data management in general and understanding that master and reference data is a subsection of data management in general, but not many people understand even data management, much less the reference and master data management, which is the idea that we're going to manage a few values that we can extraordinarily effectively leverage throughout the rest of our data. If we get the reference and master data right, the transaction data is much easier on this. That is why these things are so important, because this is the point of maximal leverage that we have in order to be able to do this. There are a series of building blocks. I've given you some goals and objectives, and also some guidance around best practices in order to do this. And now we're going to get to a little bit of takeaway, and as we approach our Q&A, I'll just do a little bit of summing up here. The DIMBOK, which is the wheel that I showed you earlier, the name of DIMBOK here, used to include a reference card, if you will, or in this case, it's an activity model showing here. So there's our definition of reference data: planning, implementation, control activities, ensuring consistency with a golden version of contextual values. It's probably not a phrase I would say to somebody who is non-data person, but just say we're going to start managing our data better, and we're going to start off with the things that change the least: people's identifiers, things that people carry with them, addresses, things like that we carry with them throughout our process. And the goals are to provide authoritative subsets of data on which our transactions can be based, and that our goals are to lower the cost and to lower the complexity through reuse and leverage of standards, and to support business intelligence, any types of analytical efforts. I've given you some inputs, some suppliers, some participants in here, some activities that we need to do. Please don't take this that you need to do all of these perfectly at starting. These are things that you can do. Remember, as a strategy, it should be guided in support of your organizational strategy. So what is your organization attempting to do? That will tell you which of these are more important and which of these are less important, which of these deliverables are more important to your organization at this point in time. And then those can evolve over time because your consumer base should increase over time as your efforts get better and as you understand the various aspects of measures in this that you can then use to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of the overall system. Notice the last thing we're talking about here, as it should be, is the tools. Yes, there are lots of good tools and they are appropriate, but they are appropriate at a later point in the organization. If you already have one, that's different. You've got some guidance here on how to get them running better. But for organizations that are getting started in this, the idea that reference and master data management is a good entry point into the world of managing your data better is a really powerful idea. And lots of customers have had lots of success with it, although the overall statistics, as I said, are disappointing and can still be improved upon. So we're coming up on the top of the hour in here. I'll just make sure that you've got some upcoming events. We're going to talk about data stewardship next month and data quality in September, metadata in October. As the world opens back up, hopefully we'll be able to get out and see some of you all. I've also included some references in here for you to take a look at. They're a little bit dated, but they're actually quite good in order to do this. Bring us to the top of the hour, and Shannon back online for a series, hopefully, of good Q&A.
I love it, Peter. Thank you so much for another great presentation. And just to answer the most commonly asked questions, just a reminder, I will send a follow-up email to all registrants by end of day Thursday for this webinar with links to the slides and links to the recording along with anything else requested. If you have questions for Peter, feel free to put them in the Q&A section of your screen. So diving in here, Peter, but governance requires ownership for accountability, does it not?
Great question. And yes, absolutely. How can you have accountability? You need to own the accountability, right? That's a component of it. This is obviously in response to my assertion that nobody should be allowed to own the data in any organization, that the data should be owned on behalf of the organization. And the reason for that is because people do not understand in their ownership of the data that their data is used and that their data comes from somewhere else. Very little data is created by the organization itself. So all data owned on behalf of the organization is the only workable solution in that. And I do feel very strongly with that. In fact, such that when I get to the point of talking with organizations about it and asking them about the commitment, I say, are you willing to make a statement like that so that nobody can say, I own this data? And again, let's just think about it for a minute. Who owns the data that's processed by accounting, right? Well, when it gets to accounting, it's there, but then after it's done with accounting, it goes somewhere else into an archive or perhaps accessed by parts of the organization going forward in order to do that. Yeah, I feel strongly about that issue, and Shannon's right to start off with that one. Great first question.
Oh, I wish I could take credit for the order, but it's all of our community. That's just what they wanted to know first. It's awesome. So who is accountable for ensuring quality, availability, et cetera, if no one owns the data?
So what you can own is responsibility for the data and its capabilities. So let's put this chart back up here again. The mistake I think that many people took away from the DIMBOK was that they would look at one of the pie wedges and say, that's it. And actually a solution is much more likely to look like this than it is a strict implementation of just a pie wedge. So the question is, okay, if nobody owns the data, what can people be made responsible for? And the answer is quite good. It's a very, very good question. If somebody is responsible for it, I'll give you this as a true example. There was a healthcare system that I worked for many moons ago, and one of the visits that I was making to their site, the hospital director asked me to come and said, I'm really glad you're here. I'm announcing a very specific data initiative around this. Oh, okay, great. What is it? You know, this would be fun. Well, and it goes out and addresses an auditorium with hundreds of associates that are in the room here and says, look, you guys have worked so hard. You've done such great knee surgery for us. We are becoming fast the knee surgery capital of the Midwest in here. And I've read the data. I understand this is what we're doing, and so I've gone out and I've raised some money. We're going to get a new wing on the hospital to be dedicated exclusively to knee surgery. We're going to fill it up with a bunch of knee surgery equipment that our donors are getting for us, and we've got additional training for you all. This is just going to be wonderful. We're just trying to figure out how to brand around the knee surgery thing in order to do this. Now, I was very fortunate. I was sitting on the DS looking out over the group, and I could see confusion on certain specific faces. So after the event, I went back and hunted down a couple of those folks and said, why were you guys kind of not real enthusiastic about this knee surgery stuff? And they said, well, the problem is the hospital director doesn't know that knee surgery is the default hospital admission code. It's not actually a measure of how many people have had knee surgery in here. And I gave you a long story here to say that the hospital director was getting reports that showed that knee surgery was the dominant thing that was happening. But what wasn't happening was that we weren't educating, training, making the case for, which I believe is part of the role of data governance, to impose specific quality attributes at patient intake, and that they are no longer allowed to simply enter the default code to bring people into the hospital, or we need to change the default code to no code has been coded, so that there's at least an incentive for somebody to go back out and do this. Yeah, very difficult to have each of these being an individual piece, but it is a very, very good story where this particular hospital was saved from making a crazy, absolutely crazy investment, given the hindsight on this, but also showing how master data would have played a better role in this case, because if we had good control over the master data, there's no way we would have ever believed, anybody who knew the data would have ever believed that the hospital was doing a knee surgery specialization. They all knew that it was the default hospital admission code, except apparently the director of the hospital. Kind of might want to get them involved in that process. Anyways, Shannon, I babbled on that one, but I think that was a response that might be useful for you. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, absolutely. I noticed. And this next one is really a comment more than a question, but let me get your take on it, Peter. It says, I like your emphasis on master data and reference data requirements, which hopefully would precede and provide specs for data cleansing efforts.
Absolutely. Good comment. Thank you for that. Let me go back to my leverage chart here. So this is, I think, the really way to think about the true value of reference and master data here. Again, reference data is tiny. There's not many things that you control using master data, but it is important, for example, if we're going to do business with a foreign country, that country be in the list of countries we are allowed to do. That leverage is replicated in a major way, again, as we move from master data to transaction data. The transaction data is enormous in this case. And again, if we're going to do this, what it also says is that concentration of leverage at first the reference data and second at the master data level is a magnificent place to put in place controls, quality controls, such that, again, I said it during the presentation, data in this reference and master data is data that you can leverage the effect of it being branded. Right? So this is data of known quality. Again, it depends on how you set it up for yourself, but it is absolutely good stuff. Because remember, this is what we like to have. And here is where we actually are in the reality of most of our organizations. Absent a nice ERP running perfectly and integrating all of our systems in here, we have a very complex system where lots of different piles of data are tied to different piles of data. Nobody's really sure which one's the important ones and what happens to it when it leaves. By the way, another important component for all of this too, all master data stewards should be familiar with these sources and uses of their specific master data items. If we don't take this consolidation effort as we're moving from this state to the state of desired engineering capabilities here, to apply quality rules to it, we're going to have to come back and do it again And it looks to me like that would be a redundant effort that would do nothing but enrich somebody who's billing by the hour in that particular process. These can be implemented with continuous processes internal to the organization, again, through the good efforts of data governance, showing how quality, master data, and data governance all can work very well together. Great statement. Thank you for allowing me to elaborate on it a bit.
And Peter, this next question, we get a variety of this question almost every webinar. It's such an important question. You know, MDM and data governance tend to fail without all C-level and executive commitment. So what do you do when most IT leaders shy away from coming up with the data governance charter to obtain executive sign-offs to commit, establish, and empower data stewards for every subject domain area? And what do you do if the data governance director aims tactical path, having silo data stewards come up with the silo metadata going into the data catalog as a high-level glance bypass information architecture?
Goodness, that was a mouthful, wasn't it?
Yes, let's piece it out here. So, you know, first off, let's, you know, talk about gaining executive buy-off. So many people struggle with this. You know, how do you get that on? How do you get the executives on board? And is that important?
Absolutely critical. Again, as I went through the success factors on there, you'll see it figures very highly within there. What you're doing is that you're convincing executives that the way they have it now, and I have yet to go into an organization where they say everything's great, right? Yeah, everything's running just fine, and we don't need any improvements at all. So the solution to well, first of all, they have to understand that the solution to virtually every business problem is a data component. Every business problem has a data component, 100% of them. And you've got to start by educating the executives in order that they can be prepared to do this. And they say, okay, great. All data, all problems we have in the business have a data component to it. So you guys have to be part of the solution. That's a good place to start. And then take some time and get them to be a little bit more data literate. Now, wonderful thing about C-levels, we've got some very good data from the Data Literacy Project as your reference for it if you want to go look it up yourself. But when you're sitting at a C-level conversation, 4 of the 5 people around that table have no idea what you're talking about. The emphasis was added there. I hope I didn't blast anybody's ears, but they have no idea. Now, the good news, however, is the same 4 out of 5 would pay out of their own pockets to learn more about it. They feel inadequate. They want to learn more. So executive level training in advance of executive data literacy in advance of the discussions around master data management are a good way of getting them to appreciate it. Similarly, the challenges that were expressed there, Shannon, so I think I can go to part B now. Oh, and the only way that you get executives involved is to tie a data thing that happened in the organization to a business thing that happened in the organization, and hopefully to a dollar related business thing that happens in the organization. Again, I'll give you an example. It's not a great one for Nike, but remember when Zion Williams sneaker burst on there? He's wearing a brand new Nike set of sneakers, and thing blew open for him within the first minutes of the game, and Nike lost $1 billion in stock value. Well, when they started to investigate there, that turned into a data problem because they had to find out all sorts of aspects of quality. And of course, quality is a measure that gives us then the ability to pull in all of the rest of this. Does this make sense? I hope so. Did I get that? It's part B of the question. Was there a part C, Shannon? I think there was, because
Yes, absolutely. So, I not only getting the executives buy off, but getting them to empower the data stewards in every subject domain area. And what do you do if the data governance director aims tactical path, having silo data stewards come up with a silo metadata going into the data catalog and bypass information architecture?
Hate to say get another job, because that's what a lot of people are doing these days. And of course, we know that's not an easy solution to it. What has to happen there, and let's look at that glass as perhaps half full instead of half empty. If the organization decides through whatever structure it has to implement multiple master data management solutions internally and do it by subject area, it's still an opportunity to move towards standard shared data. And so you can do that. I believe you could probably model that solution and show that there would be very little opportunity for savings in this. Again, think about what's happening here. We're looking at this structure, which is kind of unwieldy. And what the proposal is, well, we don't want to do it all to gain maximum efficiency. We only want to do it for this slice and this slice and this slice and this slice separately. And we're going to put a separate management system over top of each of those. You know, separate data management system over top of each of those. No, I don't think that's the way to go. But if they want to do that, you could do some modeling, you could show them, they could even implement, and you could practice your master data management capabilities in that type of an environment. But I would also obviously try to keep people aware that, you know, if we do this well, we're probably better off, rather than doing it at the division level, to do it at the organizational level. And I think people will pretty quickly catch on, particularly if your initiative is successful in there. That's like a test for me, Shanna.
How's your memory doing, Peter? That's good. I love it. So business requested a development of a tool without much interest in MDM or reference MDM or data governance. So how should I engage business to think about at the MDM level?
Again, wonderful opportunity. I would absolutely, sounds like I'm doing advice column now stuff, right? Happy to do that. I'm sure somebody, yeah, that's the way it works in all education situations. Is the only dumb question is the one that's not asked. So you've got a situation that's somewhat like this at the moment, and the organization could take a first step of buying a master or reference data management solution. It, however, doesn't seem like it's going to do that, and maybe a way to interpret the guidance here is that that's kind of good. Maybe what we ought to do is pick one subject area here. Again, I mentioned the doctors at the hospital. Well, that could be in the personnel database area. Create a master data management solution to keep track of a portion of that data and look at scaling it and see how easily it can scale, because eventually, as you do this, you will reach the point of diminishing returns in terms of the value of your homegrown solution. That's typically on a 3 to 5 year basis. By the way, that does tell you something here. If I've been in this business so long that I've seen multiple organizations do this, and can tell you that the 3 to 5 years is about as long as your tool will last, but that your transformation into a then 7-figure master data management solution will be most effective, given that you haven't paid for the solution, the high cost solution, for the years that you were not fully utilizing it and learning how the system actually works in order to do that. Get a story. And that's really what happens. When I go into gosh, I was working for one organization for a good 6 months, and somebody finally mentioned, oh, by the way, we're not profitable. Oh, okay. I would have started with that, but you know, lots of data problems. Let's focus the master data management on helping the organization understand the sources of its unprofitability. And if we can provide insight into that, it's likely to be seen as an effort that the entire organization can benefit. I don't know what specific instance you are in, but almost everybody on this call here has some variant of this or some larger version of this with the MDM stuck in. By the way, they always tell you that the MDM will fix everything. See, it's all taken care of. We've got it all 100%. No, it doesn't work that way. It replaces some systems, but it won't replace all. And it's likely that you'll have another system that you need to add in order to complement. Recall, I showed you the reference architectures for all of these things as we go through here. I hope that's helpful. It's very hard to do this from a long thing, and very easy to get a hold of me if you just want to follow up and ask more detailed questions. I got to tell you this. We talked about master data management with a group from one of the big banks on the 4th of July. They said it was the only time they could get together and know they could have that particular conversation. So this is a hot topic. Absolutely, this is a hot topic. Back to you, Shannon.
Yeah, very much so. And, you know, Peter, and along those lines, you know, so how do you then get them also thinking at a data governance level?
Yes, because again, the interactions between these, again, I'll just flash these diagrams quickly up here on the screen so you can see them, but come back and study them, of course, when you're looking at reviewing this at a later date or doing some planning or just want to give a chat on this, but these things are all intertwined. And so the role of governance is absolutely to make sure certain things happen that may not happen if the organization approaches master and reference data management as strictly a technology piece. Again, the governance makes the case for and says, well, again, it's just kind of an easy question. Would you want the data that you've spent all this time and effort putting in a master and reference data management solution to be of less quality than the data that was not inside that solution? The answer is probably no. I've not found anybody who said, yes, I want it to be of lower quality. Okay, how are you going to prove that it is actually of the same or better quality, which are now the only two options to you, and that can't be done unless you do some data qualitying on the data that's in the master data solution or on the way in. And governance is the process of making sure that happens. So we mentioned the data governance charter earlier, and I didn't address it at that point, but perhaps it's a good time to say that. If you haven't yet in your data governance charter taken the initiative to be able to start various improvement projects around the organization, things that might look suspiciously like a business process reengineering exercise in there. I explicitly call out the ability to initiate and participate in those in data governance charters of groups that I'm working with, because then when you do it, people will say, oh, that was actually a really good idea. You guys, by understanding the existing process architecture and creating a technical solution that provides data at a more timely point in our production cycle, we are now able to faster, better, and cheaper, whatever it is we're trying to do on the way out. So absolutely, governance is what you can use as the club or the carrot, if you will, to make sure that quality is part of this. And again, you can blame it always on me. Peter says it won't work well if you don't put quality data in your master data management system. Very, very simple.
I like it. I think we should start Peter's Corner or ask Peter a little blog. For reference data, Peter, what are some of the challenges when agreeing to an international reference data set versus data sets within just, for example, the US versus NAICS industry codes or ISO list of country names versus commonly used names?
First of all, if you're deciding to expand your business by incorporating different types, different locations, different types of customers, different modes of delivery, all of the things that do this, this reference data is, again, provides you with the biggest leverage, but also is the starting place for it. It's the very tip of the iceberg that's in there. And so this reference data that you have in here, if you say, okay, we're only going to use continental United States standards and geographic entry places and things like that, and all of a sudden you've got a member of our armed forces that's ordering something through your online system, you probably are going to find a way to support them around that. So the process of managing the various taxonomies, hierarchies, vocabularies, however you want to describe them, of coming into your organization are something that needs to be governed. You can't just have it and then not have it, or you can't add it and then people don't know that it exists. There's no point in spending the time and effort to add it if you don't set it up in conjunction with a new set of business capabilities that come into here. So this coordination effort is non-trivial, and this allows you, if you have done the effort to create systems to handle some portions of this, will give you pointers on how long it's going to take to implement, what is the overall impact. Again, a group that I'm working with didn't do this well when they set up the original system. And now they're having to expand one of their primary IDs, a person, place, or thing, right, which is one of the primary ways they use to identify customers. So if you will, their customer number isn't long enough and needs to be expanded from X digits to X plus 5 digits. And they have now managed to calculate that there are 140 production systems that they need to go in and remediate with. This is going to make Y2K for this group look like a piece of cake. But One of the questions that they're looking at is, can we hold this off until the master data management system gets in place? And we may be able, through judicious re-engineering of our existing systems base, be able to take that remediation down potentially to half that. I don't know about you all, but if I have a choice of remediating 140,000 systems or 70,000 systems, and I know I'm going to get a good result, I'll take the lesser way into that as well. Again, good point. Reference data is the tip of the spear, the start of the iceberg. Master data is the next one down. These are the things we're looking for so that we can then start to leverage our existing data debt solutions.
All right. So
I put Shannon to sleep on that one, didn't I?
no, you did not. No. I was just pondering. I was pondering the next question, but I'm going to think about that a little bit, how to present that. So this particular use case was sponsored only by a silo business due to an audit. The project doesn't have an. So we're diving into. So sorry, they were expanding on a couple of different questions here. So let me move on to this. Sorry for my tripping over things here. I just want to make sure I get this right. Is MDM a prerequisite for using advanced analytics?
MDM can be extremely helpful in leveraging your analytics approaches. It's again, really insightful question, because what we're really trying to do is get a handle on. I think this is going to be the theme slide for this one going forward, Shannon. The little yellow dots, right? If we can get a handle on our data by managing these two types of data in order to better manage all of our transaction data, what is analytics, of course, but understanding what's happening in our organization. So yes, again, the quality is just the first step. The governance part means the right controls will be applied to the various types of and flavors of data that come into this. And again, everything that we're going to build on top of this in terms of whether we're going to ship it into Tableau or move it into AWS or whatever our particular flavor is of doing this, absolutely will be governed by this. So the quality controls that we put in place for reference and master data will vastly simplify the analytics that we do, because we're improving the quality of the data that we're delivering to the analytics effort. But there's another important piece here, and that's the piece that's right here on the center of the screen. I would circle it if I was more facile with Zoom, but common data structures. The more we propagate these common data structures in this governed environment, the easier it is for our analysts to reduce the amount of time they spend in their analytical efforts from 80% of their time fixing, engineering the data, and 20% of the time analyzing it. If I only change their unproductive time from 80% to 60% in there, I've doubled their productivity because of the leverage in there. Data quality and data structure problems are the two things that drive data scientists crazy. And so if you want to speed up your analytics efforts and you have access to this type of piece here, understand what you have in your existing environment. What are the controls? What data controls has the master and reference data already gone through by the time it gets to become a input to an analytical process? And that will help in immeasurable ways. Again, great question. Thank you so much for it.
All right, Peter, I think we have time to fit in one more question here before the half hour. So we're building a reference data repository as well as starting to implement data governance. We don't have a data quality stewardship role defined. So would like your advice on what you feel are the top 3 items to handle first?
Gosh, I'm so sorry. I don't know. I would suggest that at least you create the requirements for data quality, even if there isn't a function defined, because as you start to move forward and people start to point fingers when bad stuff gets in this chain that then pollutes something here, that then pollutes a portion of this. My cursor is showing up, isn't it, Shannon? I'm just not waving my hands. I set it so it should show up. So hopefully you can see that there.
Yeah, you can see it. Yeah.
Thank you. It's somebody's going to get upset at some point. So defining what those requirements should be, even if you don't have the ability to implement them, you can then go back and do some measurement. Management does like to listen. One of the case studies in my monetizing book was done by a wonderful individual who said, I looked at what IT was going to deliver to me, and they told me they had essentially gotten about 40% of the data that I wanted covered by this particular analytical exercise. And I said, great, so we're not going to pretend the project is done at this point, even though the time is up and the money is done and everything else. And that additional effort that was put into that, she personally was able to show $50 million annually in savings because of that refocus around that activity. Putting in these quality pieces, even if you don't have the ability to implement them, that analysis work is going to be tremendously valuable. I know you said you wanted three things, but I would just start just with that and say, if we can't solve these quality pieces, how is the rest of this going to work in order to do that? I'll probably wake up in the middle of the night with the other two for you, but we'll give that a shot. Now, like I said, reach out if that's a question. Shannon, I think we are out of time at this point. As usual, such a
We
fun
are.
activity
Yeah,
for us. Thank you.
indeed. It really is. And thank you everybody for being so engaged in everything we do. I just love it and love all these questions. Again, you make me look smart in front of Peter because that is not me who's prioritizing all of these questions, but you all. And want to just a reminder, I will send a follow-up email for this webinar by end of day Thursday with links to the slides and links to the recording. And Peter, thank you so much. We also, he's got the upcoming topics here, and we're
And
about to
tomorrow's
put
data
in.
architecture online, right?
Yeah,
So
Data,
I've
data
participated in
architecture
that
online.
many years. Great event.
Yeah, it's fun. I'm excited for that, and we may have some music for tomorrow. We'll see. We'll try and get something going for everybody. But yeah, and Peter and I are gonna start talking about 2022. So shoot me an email or shoot Peter an email if you've got insights into what you want to hear in next year's lineup as well. Otherwise, we'll see you all next month and look forward to it. So thanks everybody. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks for staying engaged. Thank you, Shannon. Good to talk to everybody.